Okay, I'll call this workshop meeting to order. I believe it's September 26th. Had quite a week, so I'm not sure what day it is. We have a number of items to talk about for possible zoning amendments. First on the agenda was the topic of co-living, and Mr. McNabb, who's with us this evening, presented a proposal at the August meeting for us. It was referred from council. I assume folks have had a chance to look that over, and Peter put it in the memo as well. Although it's a workshop and it may be unusual, Mark, if you want to sit up at the table and help answer questions, because this is kind of a new topic. Unless anybody has an objection. So, I know Bill raised some questions at the August meeting. I've got some questions just to understand things, but maybe if you want to just, do you want to explain it, Mark, what you, and how, basically, what the are you calling co-housing or co-living? Which way you?
We're referring to it as co-living.
Co-living.
And pretty much the narrative we presented was clear on what we were envisioning. There were a few subtleties after that I wanted to clear up. We weren't for co-living. Our primary intent is to provide living for about 50% of the people are individuals. They're either single, divorced, widowed, and so co-living was kind of like trying to deal with individuals as an option to lease versus a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. We did not intend it to be short-term stay. I think we had a little confusion on that on one of the write-ups. We're not envisioning it overnight rentals. Primarily, we're looking for year leases. I don't know if I have a hard line on what the minimum should be. It certainly wouldn't be less than months. We think that a hotel is the overnight vehicle. A boarding house may be an overnight vehicle. Co-living, though, we're looking for it to be, in essence, an apartment for an individual. Very similar to colleges where dorms you come in and a number of people will flank a common area. So that was our intent. We're not even allowed to have boarding houses downtown. So we basically only have apartments, micro apartments or conventional apartments. So we're looking for flexibility to do something more in housing than that very narrow, limited apartments or micro apartments downtown. I also just wanted to always speak to parking that, I've been here 40 years and for the majority of the time downtown, we had no parking requirements. We're a 400-year-old city. We were subdivided back at Church and State, separation of Church and State, the Gleblands. We just don't have that ability. So when the zoning puts in a parking requirement for our historic downtown city, when the vast majority of buildings are built on lot lines, we just all have an inherent hardship from get-go. So, hence the city of Portsmouth got in municipal parking as they did sewer, as they did water. And we can't provide parking any more so than we could provide sewer or water. And that's a very important thing to follow. It's not the same as in suburbia. It's not the same as when you can create parking. But in our downtown area, we physically can't do it. And I think we should normalize that, call it out, understand that. And the permitted uses, the city of Portsmouth makes a lot of money at parking, and the taxpayers do not subsidize that. They profit from that in the general fund. So I want the planning board to understand that for most of my career, For the longest time, the city would do a baseline calculation on buildings downtown. And if you were going backwards on parking, you didn't do anything. Since almost every building went backwards on parking, like office to residential, restaurant to residential, there were always less parking spaces. Then they did a brief period of an impact fee. And again, in recognition, you can't provide parking. And then somewhere, somehow, the current zoning got in where that for residential uses, you have to provide parking. And so we've got a double problem. The one problem is that we don't have enough options for people to live, and we have it very expensive by requiring parking. I understand in our car-centric culture that people who love a car have a really hard time following this, but there are people that don't have a car. There are those that aren't allowed to have a car. There's those who can't afford to have a car. It's not the majority, but it's not 10%. Statistics run 20%, 30%. So our presentation to the planning board is to embrace that and give those people that don't have a car or want to share a car or can't afford a car or who choose to walk a little further to save money. I chuckle at the younger generation that I know down in Cambridge. My daughter lives in Cambridge. And what they will do to save on parking, it's a riot. It's just comical. And so they'll take a cheaper place and they'll walk a block or two for their car.
So I get the parking issue. I think that's probably the more easily understood aspect of this. However the board feels about it is a separate topic, but in terms of understanding the metrics and how that might work, back to the co-living, if you have kitchen facilities, sleeping facilities, bathroom facilities, that's a dwelling, and then you have shared spaces. Can you explain how it's different than what's the difference between co-living and the micro apartment?
Well, a micro apartment is a self-contained unit. So you can live in that unit, you're cooking. It's a self-contained living unit. Co-living, as we've presented it, is it doesn't have to have a self-contained unit.
It could, but the way you worded it, it could. So
well, it could, because what we're trying to be careful of is that a lot of our old buildings downtown, a certain unit template doesn't always work. So for size and dimensions. So some of them, and there's different amenities. So there's a lot of room between a complete living unit, like a micro apartment, having your own kitchen and bathroom, and just a bedroom with nothing in it, and flanked around common area. So in the middle, and in the middle of pricing for an individual, and just think of it like if you were yourself going to rent something I'm going to say right now. Would you rent a bedroom with nothing in it over a room with your own bathroom? Your cooking's out in a common area because kitchens are piggy. They take a lot of room. They're very expensive. They take a lot of space. So there's other products that are conveniences for individuals that if we can do that, if we can create a bedroom with its own private bathroom, that's more desirable for somebody living than one without.
of course.
And that's not a micro apartment, and that's
Right.
not an apartment.
So in your, I hesitate to use the term perfect world, but let's say you had the most flexible co-living label for a building. Inside that building with a co-living label, you could have bedrooms only, bedrooms with bathrooms and kitchen.
Well, when it's a
And it
bathroom
could,
and kitchen,
it could
it's a
flux,
micro
it could change over time. The idea being to provide the developer, the owner, with some flexibility to adapt to the market as it, is it?
Yes, well, adapt to the market, more so on that, it's just dignity. Like if we can
Well, the
create-
market of people is what I mean, not necessarily profit. I'm talking about the people who want to do this. I'm trying to understand, because under our conventional zoning, you could have micro apartments inside a building in a designated area. If you wanted to change those to something else, it would be a new approval. So you're trying to avoid that, is that correct?
Well, yeah, the current micro apartment, I have to provide parking, and it's you quickly get up to, you bump up to the 500 square feet quickly, because just to get all those things in a unit. So a co-living apartment has the option to be a lot less square footage than that. A bedroom could be,
Okay, yeah.
half
Well,
that size.
I think I understand what it is you're proposing, but now I'd like to hear from the board members and questions, and, yes, Greg.
Further along your question, why isn't this anything, this seems to be a boarding house. I mean, the definition of a boarding house is shared space
Actually,
and
Greg,
private bedrooms.
could I interrupt tonight?
Sure,
Could I read the definition of boarding house?
please do. You're,
I
as
had the same
always,
question.
as always, very well
So-
researched.
I have the definition of boarding house from the zoning
Yep.
ordinance, and it reads, "A residential structure other than a bed and breakfast in which rooms are rented, leased, or otherwise made available for compensation to more than 2, but not more than 10 individuals, and where such rooms do not contain separate cooking or bathroom facilities." So, Greg, you can continue, but I, like Greg, what's the difference between co-living
So
and
the
a
only
boarding house?
the only differential that my associate here just said was the possibility of having an ensuite bathroom using real estate terms. When you get on the path of having common cooking facilities, which is different than having a 3-bedroom apartment with 3 roommates in Portsmouth, which I know very well because I'm a landlord. Now you have a health liability. So if you've got a common kitchen, who's in charge? That's why you call it a rooming house, so that the health department has jurisdiction over it versus the landlord and the lessees having a legal agreement outside of the health department. In other words, the health department can't come in and inspect the kitchen in my 3-bedroom apartment on Austin Street. However, if you have no defined term in here, which doesn't say 1 day, 2 weeks, 6 months, now the health department needs to be involved because nobody's in charge. There's no proposal here to have, we talk about college living. That's great. In the dorms, you have an RA. Who's the RA?
Well, we have ones in Portsmouth now that are like that. The one on Middle Street, that's Bob Vicara, is 10 rooms flanking common kitchen, their bedrooms. So we have those in Portsmouth. And, like anything, it all depends on what path we're looking for. There is no question it comes with complexity. There is no question it comes with responsibility.
We're talking about changing zoning, so we need to not address what exists. We're talking about making this work with conditions based on the concerns of the planning board, which is why we're here.
I think that's the point. I think
Thank you.
to understand the complexity, and then, it's both your points, to understand what the complexities are and what complexities need to be addressed and others might need to be worked out, by the people managing the building. There's a difference there. And from a zoning perspective, especially when we're talking about downtown, I think we have to be careful about it. I wouldn't feel bound by the existing zoning because we are talking about something that's potentially new. So if we can vet it and talk about how it might work and consider if we like it the way it's being developed at this meeting or another meeting, if we have another meeting to talk about it, that's what we should be doing. That's what a workshop is for. Because we can have a back and forth with the proponent. We can't have it a public hearing, you know that. And I do a lot of zoning work around the country. I write zoning ordinances all the time. I'm intrigued by this. I'm still trying to understand it. I know there's a lot of co-living facilities around the country. They're co-living organizations. If you do a search, you'll find a gazillion hits. I think what you're proposing is a little bit different because it's more urban. And that's not a critique. It's just a difference. And so the question of scale comes to mind. The 10-person limit in the boarding house seems like that was done for probably in response to what used to take place in the 19th century and the early 20th century, where boarding houses weren't exactly something you wanted pretty much anywhere in a large scale. So that makes sense. Boarding houses also can be short-term and low cost, very low cost. So that's fine, and maybe a part of this could fall under the boarding house definition, but what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm not hearing it correctly, but what I'm hearing is that this is something that's more complex than that.
Well, I mean, our intent is to not make it more complex. The awkwardness of what we're doing is that we don't even have a boarding house downtown in our zoning. So the awkwardness is there's this big gap, and we're just trying to fill that gap.
But boarding house wouldn't do it, for what you're
Well,
asking.
it wouldn't do it, but it would certainly be better than not having a boarding house downtown. You know, I mean, that would give an option. If you had no parking and a boarding house, that's better than no boarding house. But what we're after is, I mean, we have a total between the two buildings, 150,000 square feet. I mean, you know, if you had a boarding house up to 10 units, I mean, that doesn't get me anywhere. So the reality is that might fit for a small structure, but the co-living is intended to not limit. You could limit pods. We could limit like no more than 10 in any common areas, so that you don't get into something really big. Limit the night stays. We also see responsibly that it is an inspected or permitted thing. The city's got I don't know how far of a movement, but a movement where that every 2 or 3 years they would inspect all residential units. I would think that any co-living downtown, the health department comes for a restaurant with an annual assembly and health inspection. I think that some of these things come with the responsibility of the property owner. So, you know, I would propose that a co-living zone would come with annual, biannual, some inspection. It's got to be responsible, so that the characters who don't want to be responsible, or you got a way to put some teeth in it. So
Right.
That's not in the boarding house. So I would say the difference is, again, longer stays, not overnight. I think this should be something that's inspected. So your question, like a restaurant inspects health or whatever, I'm not saying we wouldn't do that. I'm saying that uses like a restaurant come with a permit structure and a responsibility to do a number of things. And I think co-living can do that too.
Greg, and then Andrew.
What?
You follow up. You had I took it. as a
Yeah, no,
follow-up.
I'm following what Mark's saying, and I see progress, so that's why I wanted to add. My suggestion, if this is a work session, I see 3 pillars. First pillar, I'll call sanitation, because that deals with the inspection. So we need to come up with something that fits this new use. The next thing I think is important is, I use the word supervision. You know, in other words, I don't know whether it's an on-site manager, I don't know, whatever, but there needs to be somebody. You know, you see our kids, you have kids, we all have kids. They go to Europe and they stay in hostels with their backpacks. There's a lot of ski clubs in New England that own dormitory type buildings, where if you join the ski club, you get to stay in your overnight for $30-40 on a bunk in a common room, and then there's a bunch of other common stuff, and that's to promote skiing for less than $300 a day per person.
Yep.
You know, so there's models here that can go with this. So, you know, sanitation, supervision, and term, I look at those as like pillars. So if we take those apart, because Mark fed into this, and that's where we're at, you know, take one of those one at a time. Maybe somebody has another pillar to add. Define what this is, and then write the changed new zoning, which I'm with you, Rick. Parking, so be it. If they
Let's put
sign
that
up-
aside for a moment. And
Yeah,
talk
that's what I was.
about-
Yeah. Throw that out the window. It wasn't my concern. These are the things that, and you know, you've been here 40, I've been here 30. You remember the boarding house on Islington? Sorry, but it was a shit show. So if we want to do this,
And that's where the boarding house stuff got tightened down because of that shit show.
Exactly.
And
Watch
that
your,
was.
watch your language, gentlemen, we're on
Sorry.
TV.
All right, well, but if we start over with a different thing, because obviously this is more upscale, and that kind of came out, that place started out as a halfway house.
Right.
If you recall, the whole thing down along the railroad tracks, there were many buildings down there that were halfway houses for rehab, and I looked at many of them to buy, and that was a weird model, but it existed here 20, 30 years ago. So, I mean, I think this can be done.
That's helpful. Andrew, you had your hand up, and then Bill next, but Andrew first.
Inserting where Greg has led off is sort of this idea of supervision or an authoritative figure. Yes, annual or biannual inspections and permitting is necessary, relevant, but on a day-to-day basis, you take your targeted demographic of likely to be younger professionals, younger entrants into the living market in Portsmouth, or let's call it just by nature of location, like service industry employees that could walk to work downtown or what have you. So by nature of that demographic and that target audience, the exponential increase in noise or just people in the building alone, I think causes a little bit of constraint for me. I was more recently in a dorm room atmosphere than I think most people in this room. And so, yes, having an RA, having fire life safety protocols, and that authority figure in the building is, I think, how they govern it, so to speak. And that governing aspect is very important. You've got neighbors both in the building, within your respective pod or unit, but you've also got neighbors out in the downtown corridor that would be influenced by the occupants of this building. So much like any neighborly relationship, you have to be cognizant of those abutters. And it can be done. It's not a perfect equation. You have to border the line of privacy and relative intimacy of your own living space, but also the fact that you're sort of foregoing some of those privacies by sharing kitchen and living space alone. So I do think that this authority would be really important to implement or word carefully so that there is somebody at least involved in this day-to-day management. Secondarily, when you look at the CD4 and CD5 zones, there are a variety of properties that I think, if this were to go through, would be conducive to co-living. And where those properties are, I think, has to be more looked at or more intensely reviewed than just this property alone. And I know you're proposing it for the CD4, CD5 zones, so we aren't just looking at one property. So it has to be looked at as, how else could this be implemented, not at such the scale that you're proposing, but maybe it is the 10 units, maybe it is a 3-story building in the middle of Hill Street or Hanover Street or the Rock Street neighborhood, because some of that is CD4 and CD5. So I'm trying to draw myself out of just your project and look at all of downtown and how this would influence some other streets in town and ipso facto other neighbors in town. So.
Well, I think on that limits are really important. Like the boarding house has up to 10 rooms. So I think that there has to be boundaries on this thing. I want it for my own property, downtown. I don't want to do anything negative. So I think just like a boarding house, if we did something co-living that up to a certain number of units, like let's say the boarding number units, 10 rooms, over that, you have to have a full-time on-site RA. Something like a limit where that the smaller ones, you couldn't have an RA for 6 people or 8 people. So have a threshold, allow that threshold, because we don't even allow boarding houses. So allow that threshold, and that might look a lot like a boarding house. But you got to pick a word. I mean, I got to call it something. Co-living boarding house. There's so allow that, and then as you go higher, just like a dorm or a college would have, you'd have an RA per floor, or you'd have an RA per 20 rooms, or you'd have you have that responsibility. By the way, if that was in it or not in it, I wouldn't do it any other way. We'll absolutely have full-time employees here.
So let me pause you there, sorry to interrupt. How can we word that in a zoning ordinance? Because I think it's a really, really important detail that you're acknowledging, right? But if I took my planning board hat off and said, okay, I'm a landlord and I have a 4-unit building, and one of my tenants is just really responsible, maybe they shovel the driveway, maybe they're, sweeping up the stairs or what have you, they're just responsible and they look out for the property, so I shave $100 off their rent. That's a pretty unofficial title for that person to carry. I didn't ask them to do it, but they're just a good person, so they do it. How can you translate that or implement that into what you're describing in this model that you would be operating?
I would share that was the model on Islington. They had a live-in manager who had free rent. And there was no incentive to do a good job because it was there to protect us free rent. So I'm following your point, and Mark might have a creative idea.
Well, before Mark says his creative idea, and I know Bill had his hand up, let's focus on concepts, not wording specifically, because
point.
everything everybody
point.
has said, I know how to write it, and especially with Peter's help. That's not the problem.
Stay on the
Get-
pillars.
Yeah, stay on the strategic ideas. And, the other stuff that's the easy part,
I think
frankly.
but you have to distill it down to its very rudimental form, such as how do you govern this? Because then as it grows and how you strategize it and how you word it will eventually become concrete. And so
Right.
all of that would then compound, or if it is not governed or is not written correctly, it would compound and get worse. And so that's what you want to avoid, is sort of that, hey, neighbors are knocking on the door, or the rest of the residents of downtown Portsmouth are like, hey, why is this going on now? And we don't want to omit anything from this writing or this articulation
Right.
so that it's not there. So that's why I'm distilling it down to these really granular details in hopes that we can avoid any unforeseen consequences.
No, well, your granular detail is actually a big point. It's an important strategic point, so that's a good idea. And the other thing, I've said this to the board before, it's not a personal approval. Once you do a land use approval, it runs with the land. So we have a very responsible developer sitting at the end of the table. He may not always own that building. He won't always own that building, because, no people are forever, but,
We need to plan for the next guy
right.
who doesn't want to come here and talk to us.
And I want to be clear, I want it strict. I am not looking for a free-for-all. I am not looking for a flop house. Anybody who knows me and knows the buildings I have and the way we keep them up, they know that's a fact. So I'm actually looking for what we all here would like to see.
And we appreciate your input. Unfortunately, the Herald threw it out there in a lot more general.
Let's focus on this discussion and not what's been in various
but it
papers.
blew up.
Bill
I
had
have a
his hand.
question after Bill.
Okay. Bill, you had your hand up for a while.
So I would, this discussion is good, but I would ask if Peter, for the next time that we think about this, would do some national research to tell us what best practices are. I feel a little bit that we're inventing something that's been invented before, and we don't really have, all the wisdom that a trade association that manages this type of property would have. So maybe for the next time, we could do that. I've got two frames of reference. One is Bob Vaccaro's place on Middle Street, and the other is, I lived in San Francisco for 20 years, and I'm pretty familiar with the Haight and this type of a housing facility in the Haight-Ashbury. Vaccaro has a very strict set of rules, and it would be useful to understand what they are. There's a community feeling in his facility. There's a issue of noise internally at night. What time do you have to turn off your electronic boom box? There's a question of protecting property, personal property, that you've got to have some way of doing that, which is obviously potentially a significant problem. There's an issue of who cleans the refrigerator. I know that when our grandkids are around, we have a problem that arises with that pretty quickly. So there's a task list that people have to buy into for sharing tasks unless the landlord provides the services. There's an issue of selection. Who gets to live there? You're not going to want everybody to come in, and there are people who would destroy the dynamic of the of the plan of what you're doing, and you have to think about discrimination statutes and whatever when you start thinking about who you're going to allow in, who you're not going to allow in. There's an issue of, in order to have the right community, there's an issue of duration, and I think in the draft that we saw, there was a 30-day limit, which was an increase from what previously had been open-ended, and so there's some duration component that you need to think about. There's a scale component, which seems to be very big. If you have 60 people doing this, it really is very, very difficult to manage. If you have 10, perhaps you can have some community perspective. Inherently, you don't have living space, so the people that are there, when they're not sleeping, they're going to be somewhere. So you have a neighborhood question, which can be categorized as loitering if they're not living within the place where they live. And I would even ask if the police department has a trade association set of thoughts about, different kinds of living and what it does if there's no recreational component of what they're doing. So it can be handled, but there's with the loitering kind of worst case, you've got potential petty crime and drug kind of stuff, depending on who the people are and how much supervision there is. Not suggesting that we're having a drug den here, but I'm kind of thinking back to my San Francisco perspective. It was a significant problem there. So I'd like to keep the parking thing separate. I think we do need something in San Francisco. I don't know that it's right, or in Portsmouth, I don't know that it's right downtown, but that takes the structural cost out of housing, and a co-living or rooming house is one very good vehicle to do that. But there are a lot of potential whatabouts that you've got to do, and I don't think we should think that we can think of them all. I think that there are best practices that the industry has gone through, and it would be useful to look at a model from the industry.
Okay, good, noted. Paul, you had a question?
Yeah, Mark, do you see this as a commercial or a residential use?
Residential.
So this could be my physical address.
Oh, absolutely.
And so being residential, then folks wouldn't be paying a rooms tax.
No, these
I
are,
looked at the RSA and I couldn't really find anything
no,
that made it clear, like length of stay or how they determine
This
who
would not
pays a
be a
room
rooms
tax or not.
no, it wouldn't be, these are longer term rental. I mean, in some respects, it's how people used to live in downtown Portsmouth before zoning came in. That's how all these buildings used to be.
But now we have zoning, and
Well, right, but you got to see how zoning happened. you
we're
know.
trying to figure out how to ask the council to approve a new use in CD4 and CD5. And
Well, they're longer stay. I think if we stay on the common things, the abnormalities, the bad actors, and the bad examples, unfortunately, tend to be there in anything we do. And it's unfortunate, but we don't want that to, we need to protect that, but we don't want that to be a reason not to do it. There are many people who are landlords downtown that are poor landlords, that have places that are ready to burn down and that are absolute, people shouldn't live in them.
yeah, and I'm not concerned right now with the potential downside or anything like that. I'm just looking at it as a zoning use. So it would be a residential use in
Long-term
CD4
rental,
and CD5,
So say year leases.
subject to residential code.
Residential
not
use.
commercial code. Don't have to have, like the hotels have, the fire escape route on the door on the way out and that
Right.
sort of thing.
These, these aren't priced to be, they're priced to be less than renting apartments, but they're not priced to attract that kind of problems. These are priced for workers and professional workers. A lot of them we would view would be payroll deductions from employers. And that's what we're after. We're not after this to be like our rooms, the reason we wanted this flexibility is one of the problems we've encountered through visas and J1s and other kind of co-housing that exists now unofficially, is to have a private refrigerator in each room. They're really nice. They're 2 feet wide. They're full-size refrigerators. So you keep your food products in your room, and you just, what you have in common kitchens are the common commodities. But you're not keeping your lunch meats and your steaks and your stuff. That's in your room, and you take it out in the common area and you cook. So there's these things that have to be done to do it so that that's one of them. The other one is a lot of the rooms would have just a small sink with a microwave so that you can brush your teeth at night and have a cup of tea. What I'm trying to say right now is the flexibility of creating something that we don't have now. We want to see that flexibility. Everything I just said, a refrigerator in the room, or a kitchenette with a sink and a microwave, or one with a bathroom, or one with neither of them. It's all of those together that produce benefits and different than needing a whole residential unit. And I don't think we should be restricting those. I think we should be restricting the number of units, the number of occupants, behavior, licensing, permitting, sanitary. I think we should be permitting that. We should be regulating that. But we should be creative because we do it now. If you can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment, you're sleeping on someone's sofa. In essence, that's what you're doing.
Okay, Joe, you had a,
Yeah, it's sounding a lot like kind of a hybrid between the way you're describing it, Mark. Long-term stay hotels, apartment buildings, hostels. It's a, and I'm wrestling with where would the building code apply? What is the building code language for a building type like this? That's all just something to be considered for the language. I'm completely open-minded to this idea. I think it's yet another option for, we're charged with, finding more reasonable housing in the city, and this might be one of the many options that we're trying to provide. Mark, can you speak a bit more about this vision when you had this vision? When the building, how do you imagine this when the building is full? You must have visions of when this is up and running and it's full, and what does it look like in your mind? Who are the people? Where are they going? What are they doing during the day?
I see probably half of the people there already living this way in conventional apartments downtown. That's how people have to afford to live. They have to get 2, 3 people, 4 people together in an apartment. That's how we do it now. It's normalizing that. So I'm not sure it's as much as new people coming in as it is. I know plenty of people that have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people that go together.
Yeah.
And when one moves out, another one will move in. None of that's permitted, So I think part of it is allowing that to exist so that you can be an individual and you don't have to collect 2, 3, 4 individuals to do it. I see it being people that work downtown. I see it being, I see it basically, they're living here now. And it's just not widely available, because the only way you can do it now is if privately you collect a bunch of people, or you have a landlord who's willing to look the other way.
Got a technical question before
I just had
Jim's
a
question.
couple more,
Oh.
a couple more points if I could.
Sure,
Well, I
keep
have the-
going.
I
I'm
have
sorry,
the mic,
didn't mean to
that's okay.
interrupt.
Are you imagining, things, are you imagining children in the building? Are you imagining pets in the building? Are you?
Yeah, we're not
Okay.
we're not limiting anybody. I didn't answer your
Okay.
full question. So what we're doing per floor is, they're actually going to be quite luxurious in this way and nice. The living areas are quite extensive,
Yeah.
with flat screen TVs and
Yeah.
sitting areas, and they're not, each floor will have its own laundry, its own living. So you would never have more than, we'd never have more than like 20 people on a floor, a whole floor of like J.J. Newberry, for example. They're spread out,
Yeah.
but each floor would have its own amenities, living. That's why the rooftop decks for everybody, that kind of stuff. There's smaller versions of that on every floor. To do it successfully, you've got to make it so that it is very attractive. It's not something that you're going and loitering out in the streets. It's something you want to stay there because it's comfortable. The living area will be more comfortable than what you could create in a micro apartment. There-
I think the considerations in the zoning, the considerations in the language changes when the complex gets over a certain size, right? A lot of these things are very easy to manage but this is when we have to get very specific.
It's a scale issue.
Because you could imagine.
Absolutely.
Because you could imagine if you had.
Absolutely.
If you had, let's say you had 60 people in this building, they're
Yeah.
all separate entities, they don't share pets, they don't share bicycles, they don't share necessarily.
Right.
So all of a sudden, you could have 60 dogs, you could have,
Scale's a big problem.
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
can be, just like boarding houses. We support scale. We support
Yeah.
that there has to be limits.
great, thank you.
So my quick technical question, this could be an issue with the state statutes. Do you imagine ownership being a possibility or just,
No.
so you would prevent a condominium conversion, or want to prevent a condominium conversion?
I wouldn't be while I'm alive doing that. I can't speak of the future, but we are not building it as a condominium like we would with luxury apartments. We could do that on the large units on the new building in the parking lot, but the co-living ones, I would never do that.
Okay, I mean, it could be done so that you could allow the conversion, but it would be a lot more complicated with the paperwork.
Well,
Then
it goes more complicated than that, Rick. To have separate living units, you have to have separate electrical meters, you have to have a number of things by RSA.
Condominium can be a mailbox.
And-
So
huh?
a condominium can be a mailbox. You don't have to have all those things. That one room with just a bed in it could be a unit.
Yeah, but it has to have its own electrical meter by state statutes.
Well, that's,
I'd have to build the building quite
let's
different.
not debate that, but it's a question, and so you've answered what you propose to do, so.
Like I'm including all utilities. I'm not having any separate utilities. I have to affordably live. There's a lot of barriers that are there. And your average person coming in spending $200 for their Comcast internet and their electric and their gas, and if they don't have good credit, a security deposit, we're doing away with all of that. You're going to come in and just pay rent, and everything's included.
Jim, you had your hand up.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just have three follow-up questions. As we move forward, I'm still a little confused on the difference between a boarding house and co-living. And so far tonight, my separating from boarding house to co-living is more than 10 individuals and the potential for an RA or a house mother. So, but again, as we move forward, it'd be nice to know what the exact differences are. And as far as the old days, we were talking about Islington Street or 21 Brewster Street. I too was around 10, 15 years ago when Brewster Street was causing all kinds of havoc. And what the city council did then for all boarding houses was every year they had to be relicensed. So they would have to come, it was on the city council agenda, and I think Brewster Street, I think there was one on Hanover, and there was one on Cabot. And I think in the spring every year, the council would vote to reauthorize their license. So that's, I don't know if they're still doing that, but I know they did at one point. And lastly, I'd like to reiterate what Bill Bowen said. This can't be, we're not the first community to do this. So I really would try to avoid reinventing the wheel and see what other people around the country have done with this idea.
Can I ask Jim a question? If the boarding house definition didn't cap at 10, would this qualify as a boarding house?
It could.
Yeah, I'm not the visionary.
It seems like the only thing, right, that you brought up and what you read to us was 10.
It could be a starting point.
Well, we think short-term stay, we're not, boarding houses are short-term stay and we're not. So there's a difference there. And that's a big difference.
Why are
Boarding
they-
house definition doesn't mention length of stay.
That's right. Meaning that I don't think it regulates it.
It's not regulated, so it can be short-term stay.
Being short. Yeah. We don't want that. We don't want short-term stay.
What would be the minimum?
I'm comfortable, I think apartments in the city of Portsmouth does not regulate the stay except for not overnight. I think it should be parallel construction to what you do with micro apartments, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom apartments. And what those are, this should be.
Greg?
Again, well, this is getting a lot more clear, but from what Mark said, this looks like an alternative to the roommate situation. That's pretty clear, because that's what everybody's doing. Like you said, they're already here. Now, with that benchmark in mind, for example, you're kind of headed towards the idea of a high-end apartment complex where somebody would rent a studio in a high-end apartment complex to get the amenities of the community space, which honestly heads a direction towards when I travel. I love Marriott properties, but I don't want to be trapped in a hotel room, so I rent like Spring Hill Suites, so I have a microwave and a refrigerator for my water, but then I hang out in the lobby where there's a TV and stuff, so you're not trapped in a hotel room. So, but you mentioned price a couple of times, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I have an older building in Portsmouth and I get $1,000 a bedroom for a 3-bedroom. Where does this gonna land? Because if, a studio out at West End Yards is $2,100, and then you come downtown to an old apartment building like mine, it's not awful. Our friend over there has been to my building. I get $1,000 a month per bedroom for a newly renovated granite countertop, stainless steel, new windows with 3 parking spaces and laundry. So where do you envision a price point for a bedroom?
Well, again, it all depends what you're referencing. I don't know if what you're referencing is permitted by zoning, if you're renting a bedroom.
No, I guess they're all 3 on a.
They're 3-bedroom.
Severable lease.
Excuse me?
They're all listed individually on a.
Individual on a lease
Yeah.
in one unit, even though some people would say that's questionable in our zoning if you're allowed to do that. We're normalizing this, though, in the co-living. So some of those things like that, if they're not in the same household or the same family or the same, it's a slippery slope how people do that. When they do it responsibly,
30 years, nobody cares.
I understand.
That's different.
But there are people that do it not responsibly.
But VRBOs are not allowed in Portsmouth.
Yeah.
So we're renting
Without-
something short-term,
Understood.
which is
But-
called
but-
a
but-
VRBO.
Mark, without saying a number specifically, we've heard a range. Can you give an idea? Is it going to be like a fraction?
It all depends.
half
It all
of-
depends what we get approved and
Sure.
the size and
Sure.
parking. But to answer your question, you can't pick up the newspaper and say, I have a room for rent for $1,000.
Absolutely not.
So it's making that available as a product. So let's say it's the same price as $1,000. It gives a place for individuals to be able to rent as an approved use a new unit with safety on that and not assemble 2 or 3 people.
Andrew and then Joe.
You had mentioned kind of doing away with security deposits and lengthy due diligence for tenants. Joe had alluded to families or children. I have no doubts that you'll follow like the equal opportunity or fair housing
Oh, of course.
policies, right? But outside of building code and occupant load per pod, how else is that regulated? Do you see just a general application like you would any other apartment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we would check credit, we would check criminal, we'd do that on everybody. Where we waive a security deposit, and I will, is if your employer does payroll deduction. I don't need a security deposit then, and it saves. I'm kind of offended by how expensive it is. My daughter lives in Cambridge. In Massachusetts, they're allowed to charge the last month as well. When she had her first apartment, she had to come up with $15,000. Security deposit, first month's rent, last month's rent, and they make them pay a real estate commission for the broker to lease it. I'm going, what? That's just really offensive.
And
And
so on that note, and as we've talked about already, this idea of scale and how this is implemented, again, because this is a zoning into CD4, CD5, so outside of just your property and how we can implement this smoothly across the city is, does your model work if you had to do this hybrid situation with co-living on one or two floors and then micro units on another floor? Because if we're talking about scale, you inherently pick a range, 10 units to 20 units or 10 people to 20 people. So we have to create some constraint or bracket around this language. How do you see that playing out?
it's an excellent question, and actually, on that part, I'm a step ahead on that. The reason my co-living zoning wants all this flexibility is I'll design my buildings with a mix so that it never gets out of hand I would never have all co-living in this building. There will be a mix of micro apartments, there will be a mix of conventional apartments, and there'll be a mix of co-living. For me, I'm the person responsible for making sure that it is a desirable place. I never saw this as being 100% co-living bedrooms all in JJ Newberry. I'd never do that. But to have that, I have to have the flexibility to have all of those different product to keep the number of people responsibly per floor and a mixture of them. So that answers your question where that's the way I'll be doing it.
Joe, you had,
Yeah, I'll go back to what I was originally going to say. And it's one thing, Mark, I agree that your example of what you build will be exceptional. But as we're writing the zoning, we have to consider who's coming behind you and who would say, okay, I want to try this now.
Right.
And I don't think we can write in that you can't charge a security deposit. We can't get that.
You can't do
deeply.
that.
Right.
no, it's
So
not zoning.
It's
It's a feel-good thing.
It's a feel-good thing, and it's a wonderful thing. But I was going to ask, can anyone tell me why is it that we don't allow unrelated people to live? What is it about our zoning that
It's the definition of a family.
the definition of a family? Now we see we're getting it's kind of a little archaic, isn't it? The
Well, it
thought of-
goes-
the thought that we can't have people sleeping in the same building because they're not blood related.
Just quickly, when mental health institutions were deinstitutionalized,
Yeah.
a lot of those people were
Unhomed.
unhomed. And there was a market for group homes
Yep.
for them. And some people took advantage of those people who weren't able to really look out for themselves and placed them in buildings that weren't properly managed. Nothing like what we're talking about, but that's part of where that comes from.
It's also why universities have laws about sororities, because it would archaically was used as a brothel, and so a lot of towns, Massachusetts specifically,
Yeah.
because it's that old, has that language in it, and so it prevents a lot of these
So
kind of
we're-
commonalities.
What Mark is presenting and what we're discussing is, we're kind of victims of this kind of Puritan thinking and this old, we're afraid of what has happened in the past, therefore we wrestle with,
And two guys have mentioned it, sorry to jump in, but looking at what everybody else is doing, and it's interesting because our closest, nearest big mass of students, Durham has a really weird zoning where you can't go up there and buy a large house in certain areas and put students in it. It's against the zoning.
They're three unrelated.
Exactly. So there are hybrid things to what Rick gave us the history on all over the place locally.
But what we're talking about generally, the sense I'm getting is that there's a lot of stuff to figure out and a lot of stuff to, other information to pull in from other resources for us to talk about. But basically, it sounds like a residential building, which could have commercial on the first floor, whatever, but basically the upper floors are residential, could be a mix of micro apartments and this urban living concept, that could be whatever we end up calling it, that could be a mix running from bedrooms alone to bedrooms with bathrooms to bedrooms with, maybe all the bedrooms have the smaller refrigerator or not. That's a question, I guess, can zoning go that far? That's a good question. Up to what would constitute a dwelling unit, which it might have a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a sleeping area, which might be a family urban living unit or something like that. The approval that the planning board would be granting for something like this, the micro units are easy. That's done all the time. We figured that one out. The question is now we've got, I think there'd be a maximum number of occupants in the co-living, the urban living concept. Is that what people?
per suite or per
Well,
building?
an overall, but then what Mark said, made up of pod elements, which each, so whether that's 10 in the pod or 12 or 8 or whatever the number is, I don't know what the number
And
is.
the pod would have a requirement as
Does
well.
that become
yeah.
a boarding house? Like if it's capped at
Well,
10?
like the
like-
pod would have a supervisor per pod or something
Now, the
along that.
boarding house remains as a 10-room thing that's probably never going to happen again, but, it could. This is something that's an agglomeration of those units, those pods of something. Each one of those has its smaller set of regulations, but then the agglomeration of all of them, which could go up to a number, I think for scale, we need a number.
I
I'm
think
guessing,
fire life safety would dictate that, right?
They're going to come into play.
Well, it'll come and play, but that's
it's a
that's
separate,
got a
that's a
broad.
separate issue. You've got to conform to building codes, so.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So
Windows.
I think you pull that conversation in, and now you have at least a constraint or a bracket to how you write the ordinance.
I think the point that was brought up was really excellent by three people here, which was not to create a wheel. It's out there. This is not anything that this is in every urban area. When we crafted our co-living language, we found the articles everywhere. And, we grabbed here and we grabbed there. So
And like you said,
there's no
Mark, it's-
question that these
Yeah.
boundaries and bumpers exist out there for other co-living examples. And I think we're all agreeing, we want to see limits. We want to see limits on scale, on the length of stay, intensity, and permitting. We want to see some annual or biannual. Everybody, I think, is agreeing on that. Where nobody's looking for a free-for-all. Nobody's looking for just creating this.
So in that regard, I think it makes sense to gather some of that outside information that folks have been asking for, come up with a draft that reflects at least the talking points we've agreed to tonight, and see if we can advance this thing. I don't think we're going to advance it much further tonight. I think we've got our arms around it a little bit more certainly than I had at the beginning. Andrew, you had
Only last point, and I appreciate your time, Mark. As we look at this from the city perspective, only because it was recently kind of brought up and then unfortunately became a problem, we permitted units with a parking waiver kind of as rentals, and evidently they became for sale. So now we have for sale units, and I know you said you're not going to be selling yours, but given that it could happen in other buildings where you have individual electric meters, you have in a condo kind of conduit, so to speak. I know that doesn't sound great, but like you have this route to becoming condominiums. I think there has to be some sort of preventative nature or preventative mechanism against the for sale
Big
component?
note about that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, like Andrew said, you could almost sell a pod, because now you've got 10 bedrooms and a community kitchen, which is kind of the idea of a pod, very simplified, but you don't want to be able to sell a pod.
Yeah.
So we'll work with staff, get some information together. If you want to send some of the information you found from other jurisdictions, please feel free to send it to Peter.
Based on your input, we'll relook at this a little more specific with some of these things. The one other takeaway, just as the planning board incrementally addresses other things, that I would encourage the planning board to do, that's not the same as what we're talking about on co-living, is I would strongly ask the planning board to please consider getting rid of parking downtown. That's separate. Let's say you don't do the co-living.
Point made.
And,
Understood.
It's just-
Understood.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
So we'll do that then, right? Is it, everybody in agreement?
That was productive.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yep.
I feel a lot more informed than I did an hour ago.
Yep.
Hanover Street zoning topics, would you like to, you've got a whole bunch of stuff background on.
I do, and I don't know how much.
Did folks get a chance to read some of the background history? And as well as what the, sure what
See
happened
what
there?
Peter has.
Right, I mean, this started in 2019, late 2019, with a citizen request to rezone some areas in Hanover and in the downtown overlay and the north end incentive overlay, and that came to the planning department. And they brought it to the planning board in January of 2020 and held a public hearing. And after that public hearing, they were going to schedule another meeting, which then we had the pandemic, so that was put off. Subsequently, some zoning changes have been made over the past couple years that relate to the building height definition, changes in building height designations for Foundry Place, the requirement that a conditional use permit is required for the north end incentive overlay, and one more. But part of the original request was to rezone some properties on Hill Street from CD5 to CD4 and CD4L1, including 361 Hanover. But that never went any further than that hearing in January of 2020. They had a public hearing on January 23rd, 2020. They did. The one in March was canceled. Right. So the initial public hearing, go ahead, Jim.
Oh, no, go,
Yeah.
you can finish.
No, I was just going to say that the public hearing in January 2020 was held, but the subsequent one was not.
I guess for me, we're dealing with a lot of old history
Oh,
here, and it'd be really good for me at least to have a chronology of what happened on the city end and what, or say what the residents did to request a zoning change. That'd be one chronology. And then obviously that ended, I think, in March of 2020. But after March of 2020, the city did things related to that zone. It'd be nice to know exactly what those zoning changes were and the dates they were implemented.
Sure.
Do you want to see that before we consider the citizen request?
The
I mean,
the memo from 361 Hanover has some of that information.
that's fine. It's just for me, it's just nice to know what the citizens tried to do when they were stopped. And then after the citizen initiative was stopped, the city went ahead and kept, I guess, modified what, kind of played on their turf. I'm curious what those things were and when they happened.
Is that this paragraph in the letter which states some changes have been adopted through other zoning amendments, including I think, yeah.
Yeah.
It's this paragraph at the end of the, not at the end, but in this memo, page 6. It's the bottom of page 6. It describes what, am I correct or? I'm reading a tiny screen here, so I could be wrong.
Yeah, I
I
think
think
you're
that
right,
might
Joe.
be, I think that might be
That's-
exactly what you were
That's
asking.
really the question.
Okay,
And I'd
okay.
like to have like side by side and just, so be very clear to what the citizens were heading towards. Then it stopped, but the city kept going independent, and then the dates and what they did for that area.
Is everybody clear on the difference between CD4 and 5 and what that would do here?
Be good to
Yes.
summarize it.
Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, I mean, residentially, it's really just the intensity of certain uses.
I don't think you can have the nightclub and
Right.
Well, it's also aesthetics, correct?
Can't have a nightclub?
It's also.
CD4, I don't think so, but 5, right?
Between CD4 and CD5, there's not, well, it's the uses, really.
First floor retail, right?
Your first floor retail in both districts, because they're both in the downtown overlay.
Okay.
Residential, there's no, density requirement in each, so it doesn't affect that. Let's see.
What about the proposed development that would not be
Work in one
allowed
or
in
the other.
CD4?
There you go. Thanks, Paul.
And so if you had, the memo from the owner went through that.
Yeah. Do we believe that to be accurate, that the current proposal is in fact more in keeping with the requested zoning than it is the zoning that exists now?
Well, the on Hanover Street,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
Because you remember they presented their two plans. One was maximizing with that big building.
Right.
And then the second time they came back, they had just the
The
residential.
first one was more CD5.
Right.
Right, and the second was closer to CD401. But if it changed to CD401, that they would have to abide by a density of 3,000 square feet per unit, where in CD4 or CD5, there's no density requirement.
It's a land requirement, right?
Right.
It's like a lot size. Think of it as a lot size.
So I guess to Paul's question, their current version 2, would it meet CD4 or would it need variances from CD4?
I haven't looked at it in enough detail to answer that question. I think they think it conforms. I don't think anybody has looked at it in
So
that
CD4
detail.
is more restrictive,
Yes.
and it potentially could meet CD4 if the whole parcel was CD4. Potentially.
Well, the Hanover Street, I don't know about the back.
Okay. That's where we're getting.
Well, no, I mean, I think it would be fine if it was CD4. I mean, because the back of it is still in that incentive overlay where they can get the conditional use permit for the
right.
extra height.
If they get the
And
conditional
the
use.
height doesn't change because the height is based on the street.
So I think Paul really drilled it down to where is there really an issue here?
Well, keep in mind, the plan that they proposed is vested.
Right.
If,
So, yeah.
assuming they follow through within a year with additional work, which I assume they will.
Yeah.
But,
So we need to compare and contrast what we
Yeah.
just discussed with what the citizen request is
have you done that?
and see if they reconcile.
Not in the way that,
Yeah, not in that kind of
Not in
detail.
that kind of detail. Okay. All right. I'm just trying to get to the
Yeah,
crux of the matter.
it's a good question. It's a good question.
How does it work if I'm proposing zoning changes on another property owner's property?
You can make the request if,
Get an
if it,
authorization.
depending on the number of parcels involved, you have to give notice to each individual property owner if it's a small enough rezone. But you can propose a change on somebody's property without their permission. May not make
Now
friends.
that
but-
that's out there.
No, it's,
Yeah.
I mean, zoning is, it's a public regulation, so it's for the benefit of the city.
Well,
Yeah.
our recent gateway zoning thing, that was fairly large scale and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what happens when there's a rezoning. It's usually without the landowner's request. So,
I would have thought the opposite.
Both are not uncommon, like the one we just had. Any,
The other main difference is there's a slight intensity in the CD5, as far as building coverage and open space. CD4, you could have 90% building coverage, CD5 at 95%. So, but they're pretty similar in most respects.
I think one thing that's changed since 2020 is what's happened in the north end in terms of the building, and people have been able to see in physical reality what the zoning means. It's quite a bit different than the neighborhood if you go a little bit west, like dramatically so. So the question is, and this is a tough one in any zoning, how do you make the transition? Where do you break that, and how do you break it between the two? Because certainly some of the stuff to the east of the Foundry Garage clearly wouldn't be appropriate in the neighborhood far west, say out where Councilor Moreau lives. So, at least in my opinion.
361 Hanover was originally several stories
It was. But,
and a factory.
downtown used to be all wood too, but it burned.
And there's a couple more industrial type buildings lining the railway so that transition from the neighborhood to the railway is
Like
buffered
The
with.
self-storage building.
Yeah.
It's how many stories? 5 stories tall, brick?
What's that?
Okay, thank you.
So transitional that way too.
There's a little park there, which, helps. It's a nice little park. Yes, Bill?
So is the question how you transition from a downtown district to a residential district? That's the essence of the question.
Well, that's related, but the downtown overlay, which is also, I think, on our next topic of discussion.
You get tangled up in all the legal stuff and in the zoning areas that overlap and don't overlap. It's awful hard for me to sort that, but what you're really trying to do is transition from the downtown intensity to a residential intensity.
That's fair.
And what we've wound up with is a shorter building on Hanover Street than we have on
Need you to lean into your
Foundry.
mic a bit more. He's saying he needs you to lean into your mic.
Yeah. What we've wound up with is a lower height on Hanover Street than on Foundry Place. We've wound up with a less intense building development on Hanover Street with some gaps in it, and we've wound up with there was a goal of having some income-based housing on the Hanover side because we could do that because of the zoning, but that doesn't happen on the Hanover side. It does on the Foundry side. So, and I think the transition also, in my mind, is about whether it's commercial or residential. And originally on the Hanover Street, there was to be commercial on the ground floor, and I think we've agreed not to do that, if I remember.
It's required. They need to get a variance to have that.
So they would get a variance so there would be a transition from a commercial to a non-commercial as you move toward the residential. So in terms of height, intensity, and use, we've got a transition. And I'm just trying to, if I'm understanding right, is that essentially what?
That's part of it. I think another way to look at it is I think about this because from the residents' perspective, the current proposal is more in scale with what the first proposal was, but the first proposal does fit with the CD5 zoning. So I think the idea is if it doesn't happen under the current application and somebody else took the project over, what are they going to see? So it's a valid question, Joe.
So, like our previous conversation, is this topic meant to be discussed more generally? This is Hanover Street zoning. We're getting very specific about a project, or are we considering Hanover Street zoning as it's listed here?
we're considering it as a zoning, a legislative matter, not project-specific, but in terms of understanding the massing,
Yep.
something that I think you've been talking about a lot lately.
Yep.
If you look at the original proposal versus the current proposal, that would be an example of the difference between CD4 and CD5. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So in this conversation, we're also considering other future projects in
Yes.
the immediate area.
Right.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
just, not
And
just this
also
one.
the possibility that this doesn't get completed and it comes back to square one and we still
Yeah.
have the same issue.
Right,
Right.
right.
And it is likely that this issue or some parallel issue will occur on Hill Street, if I understand properly, that there are properties adjacent on Hill Street that
Yep.
may come into play.
I would tiptoe that line. I would
Is
tiptoe
that the
that
little
statement.
one in between the
Yes.
two that's sort of a dead end at the,
The, like Lot 6, the hotel that backs up on Hill Street.
It's parallel to Foundry, and it has those,
stops kind of at the last chance.
we were
saloon.
we were trying to understand when we were out there on a site visit, who has right-of-way access in there.
So Hill dead ends at this property.
Okay, that's what I was thought, yeah, that's what I thought it was. There was some question about whether it made the turn or not, or what happened at that turn. Okay. So what's the, you guys want to see more details about the differences between that which exists versus that which would be plus the history?
Yes, that sounds good.
That would
That make sense?
very clarifying.
Anybody, anything else?
Well, language that supports the breaking up of, I think we all appreciated when this particular application came before us, and we no longer saw a giant wall of a single building, and it was clearly separated. That to me has a much bigger impact than the subtleties of CD4, CD5, is what are you looking at? Never mind what's happening inside. What are people experiencing and feeling in their neighborhood?
It's a building length in part,
Yeah,
yeah. Is that in there?
And if it's completely residential,
yeah,
as opposed to being commercial.
yeah.
Which lends to the transition from
Yeah,
downtown.
it all ties together, yeah.
It all ties together.
And I don't think we ever wrestled with that on that specific application. The only reason we wrestled was that when we first saw it, it was presented that it could go either one way or, it didn't matter to one way or another to the applicant, which is why we
They
were kind
they
of
wanted our
confused.
feedback.
Right,
They got it.
right.
There was some arm wrestling over the height changes
Yeah.
that we went through in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Do we want to hear from the developer representative who's here?
What's the pleasure of the board? We can invite them or not. I can do it, but I don't want to do it on my own volition.
On its own.
I think it
Somebody
would
on-
certainly add some color.
It's not a public hearing, but it is a public meeting, and there obviously we have people here. So would you like to hear from one or more of the proponents of this idea?
I think it's appropriate.
Okay? Please come on up.
Do we have a spare chair? Is that the idea? Done that by Bill?
Yeah,
Bring a chair with you.
and you can sit,
Come
one
on,
of you can
Bill,
sit
there's
up
a chair
here
and
if
You
you
just
want.
have to find a mic.
I don't have enough for everybody.
We'll share.
I'm just, this was regarding the overlay incentives, and this is taken from your website, which is about the neighborhoods. And what I wanted to point out,
We can share one.
okay, is
Could you just give your name and address just for the,
Just
Robin
wait-
Hustler.
Wait till you, just.
wait till
if
you
can
sit, when you
throw
sit
a
down to the
microphone.
microphone?
Do you have one more, or no?
well, I don't know if I have one.
Okay,
I don't
okay,
even
here,
have
Okay,
one.
got it, got it, got it. Thank you.
Robin Husledge, 27 Rock Street, and I'm just up the street from the proposed development. And we worked with Juliet Walker early on when Kim Rogers Building, which is now being erected, was, going back and forth between a hotel and an apartment building and other configurations. And we realized that there was an issue and that we really wanted some transition zoning from CD5, which is the densest zoning there is, down to where we are, which is CD4L1 or GRC. And so we worked with her, and she proposed either CD4, which is on the graphic I think that you all have, or CD4W. And if you are familiar with CD4W, the difference between CD4W and CD4 and CD5, if you bunch those two together, Peter was correct, there's very little difference between CD4 and CD5. But if you look at CD4W, it's significantly different, such as max building coverage is 60%, the minimum lot area per unit, which was brought up, is 2,500 square feet versus no requirement, and the minimum open space is 15%. The other thing that is important about this is when you add on the overlays, and the reason I sent this around was because there are 2 overlay districts placed on top of this CD5 zoned lot. And the downtown overlay, you can see the downtown, which is green on this little map of yours, which does not cross over into Bridge Street. We are south of Bridge Street. And if you look at the north end is above and also does not cross Bridge Street. So now we have this overlay district, the downtown overlay, that comes down past Bridge Street into our very residential neighborhood. You also have you have both. You have the north end overlay, which comes down and gives incentives, like you can go another 10 feet higher on the building. And then the downtown overlay reduces parking, and it requires, no residential uses on the ground floor, as, for CD5. But it also impacts many other things. So we didn't want any of the overlays in that area. We feel those should have really stopped at Bridge Street. As your map shows, we are not the north end. We are not the downtown. So those districts really shouldn't be there, or the overlays really shouldn't be there. So we asked for CD4W on the buildings that fronted on Foundry Place, and then on the Hill Street side, Hanover Street side, CD4L1 for that portion of, and 361 Hanover is an odd duck in that it crosses 2 streets. It fronts on Foundry and it fronts on Hanover Street. So the proposal was that the front part that's on Hanover should be like the neighborhood, CD4L1, and that the back end be CD4W. So that was what we were working with Juliet, and we never had a public meeting. The public meeting was scheduled to discuss all of this in public with public input from, developers and fellow neighbors for that March, I think it was the March date, and then COVID hit and everything was canceled. So we never got the opportunity to come and talk to, you guys and have our neighbors weigh in. And so that was very frustrating. And then, COVID happened, and then when everything was brought back, Nick Cracknell moved forward on other zoning elements that were proposed at that point in time, like, he did the heights and some other things. But that never, even though it was the first thing on the list of priorities, that never got brought forward and discussed in a public manner. We kept going, reaching out to Kennard and Nick, and he says, I'll get to it, I want to get the heights done first. So we never, and then we're here now with, the developer that's developing 361, understandably. I mean, it's a great piece of property. And they have modified their proposal, and they're vested. So we are stuck with whatever they do, unfortunately. But there are other properties, like the Renlon lot that's at the end, that is also up and could be developed. And I just feel for all those people on Hill Street that are going to have to deal with, a potentially huge building at that end. So.
Okay, so we've got some history. Any quick questions of anybody?
Thank you for the summary.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, look, can I just add one last thing? The other important aspect of CD4W is the uses. So with CD4W, you go from uses like publishing, which the Heinemann, bed and breakfasts, assisted living facility. The minute you go to CD4 and CD5, you end up with hotels with more than 500 rooms, conference centers, nightclubs, which are uses that are totally inappropriate for our small neighborhood environment. So I forgot that. Thank you, Liz.
For our clarification, are any of those colored blocks up there CD4W? Because this is the first time we heard of CD4W.
Right, I mean,
Right, we never got to the public meeting.
That's what I want to know, which
no,
ones are.
CD4W is this down Islington.
The purple ones?
It's right here. This is CD4W.
Okay.
Don't touch the thing. Don't touch the screen.
No, those are CD4.
Those two are CD4.
Yeah.
And then they're right next to CD4L1.
So there's another CD4W around this.
We're hoping, yes, for CD4L1 here and CD4W for these properties here. That's already gone, this is already vested, so it really affects, that company, or if this ends up, something happens. But we never got that point to have the public meeting to talk about wanting like CD4W versus CD4.
I'm sorry,
So
Greg.
CD4
Greg,
is like
I'm
plum
sorry, yeah.
colored. It's plum colored.
CD4W is like the Frank Yard, Brew Yard.
Got it.
Yeah, that's what.
Got it.
Hanover.
Got it.
I mean, Hannaford, yeah.
W's for west.
And there's one
West
down,
End, yeah.
down there along the pond, apparently.
It looks like
Here.
Ritchie Lumber there.
Is that Ritchie Lumber?
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
What is the purple along? Is it-
Purple is CD4L2.
Okay.
I don't like these designations.
Drive you nuts.
And it's also CD4L1. Their lot got split as well. So they have CD4W and then the bottom half
So,
down by.
Liz,
Kent Street.
you have to come up and speak into a microphone. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that.
I'm sorry, it's way too much in my head all the time. So the Reese lot got split. They wanted a higher zoning, and they got changed to CD4W, and then you'll see it's CD4L1 on the other end. So that has a lot to do with the fact that, again, it directly abuts the neighborhood. This part of the Reese lot is CD4L2, but that is mostly commercial property, and it sits differently because of the way the land is. And the CD4L1 was because that's all neighborhood, so it went all the way down as neighborhood, and the CD4W was allowed there because only a small portion of it was there, and the people who were there didn't mind that it was going to be changed because what was there before was hideous. So, and on the other end, on the area that we're talking about, the significant, we didn't realize until we asked whether it could be CD4 on that end. And the way Juliet Walker explained it to me was that as long as it's in a character district, you can use a character zoning. And that's why it was talked about as CD4 at the first meeting, but at the end of the CD4 first meeting, we discussed with Juliet Walker, we had been meeting with her as a neighborhood group, and we asked her, and she said, yes, you can have CD4W anywhere in the character district. That's how it was explained. So, and for us, the biggest difference for that CD4W was the uses, because CD4 and CD5 have the exact same uses, and they're very large commercial things that can go in there. And the Ferguson building, as most people know it, she called it what it really is, but the Ferguson building is still available to be developed. The CD4 lot right there really should have been CD4L1, but they were trying to figure out how do you transition between commercial, the bigger buildings on one side and then the smaller buildings on the other. So I
Great.
think that's always a problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Liz. Did you want to add anything? You don't have to.
No, I think I should introduce myself first. Shane Forsley, 361 Hanover Street. I know you've all had the chance to read through the packet, or at least I hope you have. I think the overlying things we wanted to project to you were the comparisons from the vested plan, what I'll refer to as the vested plan, versus the alternate CUP plan, the painted rendering on the front cover with the three smaller buildings out front on Hanover Street. And we performed the analysis of how that would match up with CD5, CD4, and then also went to the extent of CD4L1 zoning. And although it's not a perfect match in CD4L1, it outlines how the three-building development on Hanover Street would be carved into a 4-unit development and still conform to that zoning. And so that's all I really wanted to offer. I think that the alternate CUP plan, although requires relief, we got some great feedback from you in our last meeting, and we think it's sensitive to the environment, the neighborhood, and kind of meets the spirit of the ordinance and fits within the neighborhood. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have or.
Not about the CUP plan. That's not for tonight, just zoning.
No, I think we just ought to focus on the fact that, they are vested, and what we really need to focus on is the definitions of CD4, CD5, CD4W, and make sure that the other transitional properties are treated
Right.
properly.
The request has
They
come,
did
request has
follow-
come to
they did
council,
follow our-
council's sent it to us, so we're doing exactly what you're saying, we
Okay.
gotta vet it.
Okay.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank
You're welcome. Thank you.
No, they did a good job. They did what we asked,
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
But we do need to check the box of what happens if they don't build.
Right. So we need to look at the difference between
But that's a legal
how it
thing.
is zoned, what the specific request is from the residents that went to council.
Yep.
What the history behind that, I don't know that we need to get too much about the history, but just a little bit more of a summary to understand maybe some of the frustration.
I mean, it's something
And-
we have to address, we need to address.
Right.
So-
And we can pick any of those the fact that it doesn't already have a CD4 WL, whatever, doesn't make a difference. That can be a recommendation. So you had a question, Bill?
So is the question really for the rest of the surrounding territory around the place that we've dealt with already? The implications of the zoning for those other sections and how that could be done in a transition way from that, and there's some specific zoning adjustments that probably could be made to do that.
That's the question, the zoning adjustments. And it doesn't have to be one, it could be more than one.
An area, like they tried to show us CD4 for the Ferguson building. That could be a really intense something.
And the other question is the overlays and whether those make sense to maintain or adjust. That was another part of the request.
Yeah, and in doing that, I hope that we and that neighborhood understands exactly what it is that they like and do not like about the potential zoning options. In the past, we've had meetings with neighborhoods and the community at large, and I've been frustrated because there's this fear of height. If it's tall, it's wrong, and that's not what determines the quality of your neighborhood. If buildings are taller, that's not what destroys a neighborhood. There's so many other things. There's setbacks, there's relief, there's length of the building, there's openings, there's light.
And as you know,
Yeah.
we're into the granular definition of height, which the general public doesn't understand. And
Right.
height is not simple around here.
Right.
It's where does it start, where does it end, what kind of roof does it have?
Right.
Height doesn't mean a vertical skyscraper.
Right, and
At
we're,
all.
and we're outside of the historic district, so there's no design review, there's no detailed design review, so the opportunity for a building's mass and setback and height,
We can
width,
control-
length,
we
we
can
can
control.
control that. But I do hope that, I'm not suggesting this particular neighborhood is thinking this way, but that the general public in looking at zoning is just simply trying to keep things from being a certain height.
Or mass.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it should be
Right.
highlighted that we did the developer, get credit where credit's due. They got rid of retail or commercial on the first floor in an area where it was allowed because it lent itself to residential and transition. And using that as an example,
Right.
I think is very important because that's,
A poorly designed short building is just as offensive as a.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were smart enough to bring it up and say, look, we don't want a Starbucks in this building because it's 3 blocks from another one. I'm being facetious, but
It
there was.
Was.
Was, but it was.
Okay, we good on that?
Yes.
I think so.
The little addition about building height, which is always a fun topic. So the downtown overlay district, Peter put together a explanation of this. I think before getting into that, those of us who know Portsmouth for decades know that if you look at the downtown overlay district, it kind of fits what Portsmouth was like back, what, about 1974? Maybe 1972 for a downtown. It doesn't fit with what's the downtown today, in my opinion. And there's some political history that is irrelevant. You know, I think the question is, does it make sense to adjust it? And as Peter pointed out in his memo, there was a proposal to adjust it, and it was adjusted a little tiny bit fairly recently by council, but I think there's some sense to a bigger adjustment. So, did you want to explain any more?
Sure, I was going to pull it up.
You can put it up on the big screen.
Is there a component of architectural design overview as well?
I'm sorry,
Is there a component of architectural design in the character districts that doesn't exist elsewhere?
not yet.
From what I understand, there's only two, in the state of New Hampshire, there's only two ways to have architectural design review, and that's a historic district or a heritage district.
No, you can actually have design standards that can include aesthetics. What's really scary is there are a couple of New Hampshire Supreme Court cases that have said planning boards can make decisions based on aesthetics. But without guidelines, that scares me to death.
Right.
You know, how do we feel tonight? Man, that looks good.
Yeah.
I don't like that. But that topic has come up. I think we need design guidelines both for the downtown and even for some of the subdivisions in the outlying areas because they could use some help, in my opinion.
So this was the map in 2012 that went to city council when they were looking at expanding the area in red to include the downtown overlay because of the development that was occurring. And the council only included the Connie Bean site, so just.
Everybody know what that is?
Yeah.
Can you repeat what you just said? Sorry.
So this came to the council from the planning board in 2012 to include this, to expand the downtown overlay district to include this area in red. And
With the dashes.
where the dash is. And they really, so, and what council did was they just included this property right here. I can show that on the regular map. So, right here. So they just included this little bit and then said, you know, we'll come back to it, and never did. And so,
Just a second,
Yep.
Jimmy had a question on that?
Peter, I was just curious, just out the gate, do you know why the city council did not approve what was proposed, just one property versus the whole section?
I didn't. I was trying to find the minutes from that meeting, looking on the old Portsmouth website. So that was, and I can continue to look for those.
It'd just be curious, I mean.
Yeah, no, I was
Must have
curious
been
myself.
some reasons,
Yeah,
you know,
and
why
I think
did
it
they
was.
accept it?
I think there was some
At the time, was that
political.
all city property?
No.
There was the old gas station on that one.
Well, the Connie Bean was.
Well, the
Oh, it
Connie Bean
was.
was, and then what was,
There was a gas station,
Over here.
Right,
at the
there was a
bottom.
gas
Gas
station
station
there.
there,
yeah.
yeah.
an ice cream shop for a while.
Yep.
So, yeah,
The gas station wasn't included in the downtown. Yeah, it's,
Exactly.
we can search, it looks like a political decision
Right.
for some reason.
Certainly looks awfully spotty.
Yeah.
You live right next to somebody. What do you zone? Well, I'm 5. What are you? I'm 4.
You downtown?
4W.
No.
That happened.
Chairman, we've talked in the past about this danger of, or this concern about downzoning. Downzoning someone's property. Can you explain how we might need to consider that?
Well, it's downzoning and upzoning. Okay, so downzoning means you can do fewer things on your property. Upzoning means you can do more intense uses. So let's say we're looking at a property that you could do 100 units of residential on. If you downzone it, you maybe you can only do 50. That's downzoning. If you can only do 50, but now you change the zoning to do 200, that's upzoning. So that's the general outline of what they are.
I think you could throw financial potential out.
It's, because of the process, in my experience, it happens both ways. People don't like downzoning if you're a developer, but sometimes neighbors do like it. Neighborhoods sometimes like it, for the same reason we just heard. That's downzoning.
Yeah.
So there's no restriction against it. It's something to think about, for sure. I'm not aware, there must have been litigation about it, because there's litigation about everything, but I haven't seen a case that would cause me to, stay away from it like radioactive ideas. Does that help?
Yeah.
It's council's decision.
I was going to
Council's
say,
decision.
Paul's, we recommend.
It's a public process,
Yeah.
and if somebody objects to it, they can object to it, and they can raise, if there are valid reasons, they raise them, they're considered, and
Would it be helpful to get Peter's definition or reason for overlay? In other words, what was the original purpose to create overlay like that?
Well, it's in that memo from Rick Tainer. It was really to create economic viability and pedestrian-oriented businesses along the street and ground floor commercial. That was the intent of the downtown overlay.
Okay.
I can give you more on the other overlays, the incentive overlays, but
No, those
But
are
this- the
those are
downtown
kind of
overlay.
the other thing, it ties into our parking discussion, because in the downtown overlay, residential doesn't require parking, correct?
well, no, residential
Or
does.
no, residential, I'm sorry. I got it reversed.
Non-commercial uses don't require parking,
I love it when we get cheat sheets.
Um,
This is a good document.
and then
Here's what you need. The first part, and that's the second part.
Thank you.
which is all in my memo.
Okay, Peter's reminding us, maybe we should take some time to read his memo.
That's right.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if it might help, I'm guilty of not maybe reading Peter's memo as well as I could have, because
Three
when I
demerits.
looked at your memo, Peter, it only had two items. It had co-living
Right.
and it had Hanover Street. There were two items discussed. And if there was a third about,
Well, this subject kind of covers both, and so I just, because both parties were mentioning the downtown overlay. and I
right,
just-
but
yeah.
if your memo could match the agenda, I think
Yeah.
that it'd be good for me at least.
It usually does.
Just a little tip.
So downtown overlay, can't have residential on the first floor,
What's that?
can't have residential on the first floor.
Oh, yeah, no, I have that, thank you.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah, he does,
Yeah.
he does, I don't, no, he does, I don't.
Of
Thank you.
course. Yes, no worries. When Andrew, do you know all this stuff?
I'm
back
good,
and
I
forth?
think. Thank you.
So to understand it, if folks all haven't read Peter's memo, and I read it, but it was several days ago, and I've been working late in the rain, so may not be the sharpest tack that I could be tonight. We comfortable discussing this? Do you want, because I know you had a sketch of an idea, right?
Well, I started looking at where it might make sense to, if you were thinking about expanding it.
Now we have to look at the big screen.
Yeah, let's look on the big screen.
This big. So the blue, if we look back at this area where they were originally looking to include,
Which didn't
so-
include both sides of State Street, right? Back with what they were doing, or did it? I interrupted you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
no.
I'm sorry.
I think it did, and I think it
Okay.
went all the way to Court Street, because this line continued down Court Street.
Okay.
And what I've done is, because this is split zoned here, this is CD4 and this is CD4L1. So I went down the zoning line.
Yep.
Which is also follows the parcels. And then you can see the current downtown overlay in the black hash line. So it would pick up all this area here.
Lower into State
So
Street.
those properties that are across from Strawberry Bank
On Court Street
would not
be in it.
Would not be in
Would
it.
not be in it.
But the ones that back right up to.
The ones that are front on State Street would be in it. 'Cause they're-
It's common practice, that's why the the zone, not the overlay, but the zone changes of the interior lot line. Typically, you want to have buildings on both sides of a street have the similar zone. You don't want to break a zone in the middle of a street typically. So, you do sometimes, but just generally speaking, sort of rule of thumb stuff. That's a good thing to keep in mind.
Because you have the.
Because you face
have
across the
museum
street.
there, the living museum.
Right.
And then you have properties that are facing it, which, from the perspective of being in Strawberry Bank, those homes are kind of an extension of it. You're not seeing what's on State Street.
But even the homes on State Street, or Court Street, excuse me, those parts, those that are in Strawberry Bank and those that are out, they seem to be different than the ones that are right around the common area.
Peter, what does the blue
So
represent?
the blue is just, I was looking at where it could possibly be expanded, and the black is the existing boundary. So this was just initial draft of, so it comes down by Middle Street and State Street and then cuts through these properties currently. And then kind of curves along Court Street. So this is just to kind of talk about if you wanted to include the frontage, or the front parcels along Court Street in the downtown overlay.
I'm trying to imagine a scenario where we would put any one of those into, how it would affect any one of those lots. A scenario where it would affect it one way or another.
Well, it would require commercial on the ground floor, and then you get parking credit, depending on the use.
Several of those Court Street properties do have residential on the first floor.
Right.
I was just gonna say.
So
that's
they'd be
resi-
lawfully non-conforming.
I think for that
That wouldn't mean they'd
reason
have to
alone-
change,
Right.
they'd be
I
non-conforming.
think for that reason alone, for me personally, if
Mhm.
it's a non-starter, I don't, having residential on the first floor is a fine thing as far as I'm concerned in that area.
Particularly there.
Yeah.
How about down to the east where Peter started?
Aren't those more,
Because there are residential buildings here.
aren't those more constrained by both lot size and HDC regulation? Almost to the point of,
Right, I mean, they could continue. I mean,
I'm thinking of, for example, here, I like to use examples, right? Real world example. The most current one are the three wonderful little wood frame properties that are across from the McIntyre building that are just being renovated. They're residential. They're all residential.
Yep.
Granted, they're very exposed residential, but they're beautifully done residential, and there's And it further reinforces the mix of residential and
And
Work,
the developer wanted them residential.
I mean, I wasn't even aware of that, to be honest. I don't remember that
One of
piece
my
of it.
part-
All
one of
I
my
know is when I
partners is
look at-
doing 'em.
When I look at it now, it's very successful.
Except you couldn't tear one down.
So
So does it make sense to have one type of downtown overlay? Maybe should there be two types of downtown overlay? I mean, is there any benefit to that?
Well, this is an opportunity to introduce a transitional overlay.
Right, something like that.
Something like
Does it
that.
make sense?
You know, when you think, there is so much first floor residential in the downtown overlay. I live in a house in the downtown overlay.
Exactly.
I won't be told I can't live on my first floor if I want to.
Right.
Right? And I know I wouldn't,
Yeah.
but preserving residential, and I don't think we have I don't see it as a problem.
I think if you're driving, state and that whole area, people like those row houses.
Yeah.
Here's the problem.
New development.
New development and the pedestrian vibrancy of a downtown, especially with the hot residential market we have right now. If, say, all of Market Street could convert to first floor residential, it wouldn't be Market Street.
Yeah, that's true.
So there is a reason for it. Now, the
Because
historic,
you need services.
Well,
Need
is there another
services-
way to achieve that then? Because you want the mix.
well, that's what we were just talking about. Maybe does
Transitional.
it make sense to have a different,
Yeah.
an additional,
Right.
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just free thinking.
I think we start with a concept.
Yes, Bill.
We start with a concept and expand.
Shouldn't any substantial change to the zoning follow a master plan and be based on 4 or 5 or 6 identified principles that we're trying to accomplish?
Certainly, this one is an overlay, which I think is a little bit different, and I think it's constrained to an area that I think we all know fairly well. I think we can have the conversation without needing a master plan for guidance, any more than what we currently have, but your point is well taken.
Well, I was just going to just elaborate a little more than what we currently have. We currently have
Mhm.
a very robust, well-done, you could say it's outdated because of the date that's on the cover sheet, but I think it's still, a lot of that still applies. We're not flying blindly here, right?
You don't have to think it applies tonight.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
are working within the rails of a master plan.
We are.
Yeah.
We are.
It exists, and it was done well, and granted, it needs to be updated, we know that, but it's not as though we're working completely wild
Correct.
on this stuff.
It's not the Wild West, right?
Right.
I don't want to beat this. It sounds like
Yeah.
some of it is too much. Maybe the idea of
Can I ask
nuanced.
one weird question that we kind of went blowing by? That section in the bottom left-hand corner where the zoning line runs right through the middle of all those properties.
That was something we were looking at, and I didn't have time to go back and fine tune it.
So is that
It's really
accurate?
just this area,
Well, I see like 2 blocks. Is that accurate that the overlay district runs right through the middle of those properties?
The dashed
The
black.
dash line.
Dash black.
The dash black, yes, that's existing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that should obviously be an action item.
What would you propose?
Looks
Well,
like it's-
pick one side or the other. Because, I mean,
Like it's selecting
The living
buildings.
room and the
Oh,
dining
no,
room.
that's the point I was making earlier, that you try to break it mid-block as opposed to on the street.
oh, so those aren't lots. Those are not whole lots that are
They're
rectangular.
back to back.
See, here's the.
They're back to
There's-
back.
there's your
They're
zoning.
the lot.
All right,
They're
thank
the
you.
lots, yeah.
That makes it a lot more clear. Thank
It's
you.
the overlay.
property line.
It's just the overlay.
Yeah, property lines back in makes it a lot more clear. Sorry for that question.
No problem. No problem.
I think it can be improved.
So, come up with some refinements to talk about further. It's not ready for prime time yet,
Yeah.
right? That fair?
No, but it should stay on our to-do list.
Oh, yeah. No, it's been for about 2 years now, I've had this on a list. So,
But to Bill's point, tying it to some objective, right? If you're
I
going to
think
expand
Sure,
the
we certainly
downtown
can,
overlay
yeah.
district,
Sure.
what objective are we achieving as part of the current?
Bill, would you be willing to look through our existing master plan to see where you think it doesn't conform, or it does, it either does or does not support this idea?
Sure.
That would be very helpful.
Well, it has pillars, the current master plan has pillars, and
Right.
you can carve out half of them and try to apply the ones that would apply.
Well, it's like the findings of fact we have to do for applications. It's a very supportive thing when we're doing this sort of work. If we can say this is supported by the master plan in these sections, that would be very helpful.
Good.
Parking.
Third rail for last.
So here's the big thing on parking. I don't know how many of you were here Monday night for the presentation by the parking consultants who've been working on it is the downtown parking. It's the downtown parking, and I've been going to the meetings for, I don't know, a year or so, whatever it's been a while. They've come up with a number of recommendations that track pretty well with what we've talked about here. They have found, they've got some metrics that I think Jim would love to see in terms of what's available for what we have for parking, how much of that parking is used. The downtown core is running at about 97%, if I recall his presentation accurately, which is above full. I think he said actually you're okay at 97%, which means there are a couple of spaces, but you're not okay at 97%, because what happens is people drive around looking for parking and it increases traffic, and it's just so. But that's a separate topic. Our topic for zoning and parking, we've talked about before, and that's taking it out of zoning and bringing it into site plan, so we could be more adaptive because it's a changing topic. You know, there's a lot of things happening with parking, and developers come up with new ideas. Cars are becoming different, parking is becoming different with automated vehicles on the horizon. Most communities have gone to putting it in site plan just because it gives the planning board more flexibility and don't need variances. Conditional use permits you can do, but conditional use permits are innovative zoning, which changes the whole appeal process. So
Straight to state.
it's more flexible to have it in site plan. So
Yeah.
that's, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, based on our discussions over the last 3 years, vast majority of communities have parking in their site plan regs. And it appears other communities prefer that for all the reasons you've mentioned. So it makes sense to me that, to put it, I'm just curious how maybe historically it ended up in zoning for us. Maybe.
I think it's
So
always
going back.
Historically, it started as a part of the land use process in zoning.
Yeah.
Going back like the early 20th century, 1910,
Oh, so that far
1915.
back, but
Yeah, it goes,
It
when
started
cars
with
were
cars.
new. It goes back that far.
After horses.
And some of the language, I've got it if you want to see it, some of the language from the first Zoning Enabling Act, when one of the Hoovers was on it, I don't think it was Herbert, but I think it's 1923. Some of that language is still in many city zoning ordinances today without even a comma changed. So,
Can you imagine the decisions years ago when they decided they were going to allow cars downtown?
Right.
How the rest of that must have been.
Oh.
That was a tough decision.
Well, maybe not. If a car was going to replace a horse,
Yeah.
they were probably doing backflips.
Well, remember, the whole idea was to clean up the streets.
Yeah,
Exactly. I
From the
mean,
horses.
Yeah.
I tell this to people, they forget, but the internal combustion engine car was a huge environmental blessing,
Yeah.
especially in New York City. The tons and tons of horse manure and the diseases.
Yep.
And Henry Ford was a miracle worker. He
Yeah.
saved the environment.
Yeah.
the city of Milwaukee had a huge speeding problem back in the late 20s, and it was a petition signed by hundreds of residents that the speeding problem downtown had to be gotten under control because it was crazy, it was killing people, it was scaring horses and other things. And so the city council actually, they cut the speed limit in half. from 8 to 4 miles an hour.
I knew there was a punchline there.
To spare the horses,
They
is
didn't
that
have
primary?
How'd that go?
That's walking speed. Yeah, I found that out when I was working on the downtown plan.
So it's not, it's less common now that an applicant that comes before this board is not asking for parking relief.
It's pretty common.
Yeah. So taking out of zoning and putting it in site plan.
Makes it more flexible? Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
you can make it more flexible, and it can be more adaptive. I mean, you can make it a more difficult process in terms of making it more discretionary with the planning board. But it just makes it, it's generally considered just a better practice, because zoning is subject to so much more legal constraints than the site plan regulations are. We can change site plan regulations with a hearing. That's a big difference.
That's
You can adapt
That's
quickly.
important.
You can adapt quickly.
quicker, that's important. It's kind of like the difference between bylaws and rules.
Yeah, and Bill had his hand up.
Regulations are
and
law.
Yeah, regulations are law, exactly.
Bill.
So the meeting Monday, for those who weren't there or haven't watched it, it really is worth watching. It's on the website, of course. It's about an hour-long presentation. It was very educational for me, being a new guy to town.
Notes, please.
For anybody.
What were the high points or the low points?
So my interpretation, the consultant doesn't want to be controversial, but he wants to raise controversial points. So you got to kind of read a little bit. I would say that within 10 years, we need a third garage downtown. And the lead time on doing that is 10 years. So we better be working on thinking about where that next garage goes and kind of making decisions along the way in that direction. The Foundry Garage is getting close to capacity. It's the central spot for the program for parking for downtown workers, and its capacity for that is being used up. So whatever the program is that the city has for helping downtown workers, we better be thinking about a Plan B. So I take from that the discussions that we have about parking, anything that incrementally adds to the number of people parking downtown, or the need for parking downtown, I think is where the bag is full, and we really shouldn't be too cavalier and saying we're going to ignore the parking restriction in this area or that. But it's really worth listening to the discussions. There are discussions like the car sharing, which is, if I understand, I know we don't. My understanding is we don't have the mass here to make that commercially attractive to people that provide car sharing, but it's one of the thoughts they have. They have thoughts about tracking electronically cars coming into the city and seeing what parking spaces are full through electronics, and being able to direct people to where parking spaces might be available. So there's some kind of newer edge thoughts in there that maybe the city hasn't adequately yet thought about. But the real strategic one to me is that we're going to need a third garage. We better be thinking about it. And in the meantime, we are in the downtown area, we're at 97% capacity utilization, and that's not there. There's also what you do in the neighborhoods, discussion about ways to limit the duration of time allowed for people parking in the neighborhoods to the benefit of the neighborhood residents. And that's a debate that the city council probably needs to have again.
You start with time limits. If that doesn't work, you move to pricing. That's what he said, and that's the way it works. Yes, Jim?
Do you know, is the presentation or the final report going to be made on the website, or is it already there?
It's going to be, it's not a final report yet. There's going to be a public meeting, do you know when? There's a public meeting coming up about parking, and from the consultants and the committee group. That will be posted on the website. I don't think I've gotten a notice about what day it is, but I think it's soon. It's this year. It's not next year.
So the presentation about this future meeting will be posted?
The notice about this meeting will be posted. I understand the presentation that was given Monday night, because I asked Ben Fletcher before the meeting, can I have it? He said it'll be posted. So I don't know if it's already up. I haven't.
It's posted, yeah.
It is posted?
It is? I don't see it.
Okay,
Oh, wait,
great.
9:23? Was that 9:23?
So is the presentation posted or the whole meeting?
The whole meeting is.
The whole
It was an
it's on
hour, it was
YouTube.
an hour presentation.
Okay,
that's
so that's the thing. All right.
Yeah. Then they moved to the regular council meeting.
Parking, the concept of moving it to site plan, take it out of where it is. We spent a lot of time on one particular project that was Mr. Kim's and Agave, whatever that
Yeah,
address is.
Okay, yep.
And the argument was somewhat successfully made that it's a less intense use going to half residential upstairs, which wasn't being used, versus the number of restaurant seats. And you look at the idea that the folks that are upstairs, those Portsmouth rolls up their streets pretty darn early around here. And so those parking spaces become available for the residents when the bars and restaurants close at 9:30. And then when they leave for work at 7, guess what? Those get used for a different use. Conversely, coincidentally, that same developer has a property that's purchased that is next to one of the larger public parking lots in downtown. Would changing this give us the ability to right-size the parking for the project per the intensity of the use of the project versus the zoning?
Yeah, you can do that, sure.
Well, that's why I think this is a good thing, because it would have been easier to look at the Mr. Kim's, that project, if it was in site plan. And we have no idea that was going to happen over on that other road, but that's a big hunk of land with a big hunk of parking spaces that is going to cause a lot of controversy the second the project gets drawn up on a cocktail napkin.
The issue I had with Mr. Kim's on State Street was that the way it was presented to the planning board is if a parking spot for a restaurant is the same as a parking spot for residents.
Exactly.
And nothing further from the truth could be.
Time of day is different.
Exactly.
So they were saying, oh, it's a lot less parking now. Well, again, you're not comparing similar parking uses.
Right.
So that was a complete ruse they were trying to pull over on us. And I still have a problem about it because, again, a parking space for one use is not equal to a parking space for another.
Which is why I'm hoping this will address that, if I might be wrong in that being a mechanism.
Well, it's not going to happen, tonight or next week.
Oh, not at all, but in our
yeah.
adopting of this idea,
It's more easy to keep it sophisticated and technical as opposed to political.
Exactly.
Yes.
So if it's in site plan, it would come with a legislative set of directives and criteria to use to help define how much space is required for different uses and places?
Yeah, the easiest first step would be to just port it over as it is, take it out of zoning, put it into site plan. That's the easiest first step. And then the planning board could work on adjusting it.
And it'll
Adding things to it, like more sophisticated shared parking, which takes time of day into, the language in the actual site plan regulation.
Even down to the granular level of if you're going to do this and you require valet, which we've seen recently, and then the valet has to show where he's gonna do it,
Right.
and the valet has to be available during business hours, period, end of sentence.
One thing that the site plan regs can't apply to is single-family residential. So if we want to have a single-family residential parking, that would stay in zoning.
I think it should be. Right?
Yeah, well, that's a matter of state law, so,
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
so that's cool.
but that's a simple thing and doesn't affect most of the bigger projects that we're talking about.
How do we move forward with this idea?
We can write it up.
Something like that, yeah.
And, I mean, is it, folks, you seem like a good idea to pursue further? Take it to the next step?
It will require quite a bit of self-discipline on the part of this group to be objective, operating with a set of rules and applying it equally.
Well, site plan is already like that, and so are subdivision regulations. We can change both. So, without going to council or anything like that, which is the way, just like, as Jim said, that's the way it works in most communities. So, you know, it's not like we're,
And I might add that our council representative on the planning board has been asking for this for a while.
I don't remember that, but,
Oh, yeah, she said multiple times in public meetings that it needs to be moved out
Okay.
of zoning into site plan. So at least that's a little bit of a buy-in for the group that sits up there sometimes.
is there anything else folks want to talk about?
Not for nothing, but this is a nice chart.
Thank you.
I spent so many hours.
I'm sure you did.
It's well done. I hope you're in this business.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I just have a couple questions, really. Planning ahead, I happened to notice in November, there are 3 planning board meetings. Is that accurate?
Yes, two are with joint meetings with the city council,
Okay,
a workshop on the CIP, and then a joint public hearing.
okay. Just
Yeah.
maybe an idea to send that out early, so all those dates, because it's near, well, it's second
Everything.
week in November.
Yeah.
So we can block off those dates. I think it's the 12th, 18th.
It was in the memo left for last week's meeting, but I'll just send out another reminder and
Oh, okay.
maybe to block
All
those
right,
dates.
that-
Yep.
And lastly, the rezoning of Commerce Way is part of the settlement with the city over the Michael Caine issue. Is that going to come before us at all, or is that going to go straight to city council?
We recommended last week that council go to first reading. We're having a hearing next month, which is soon. That's when we talk about it in detail. So the draft, was it in the draft was in the packet, right, last week?
Yes.
Yeah, so it was in last week's packet.
So there'll be a public hearing on October 17th in front of the planning
I
board.
saw that. It just wasn't clear to me. Is the GNOD, is that the
Yeah.
zoning district? It wasn't clear where the boundaries are because there wasn't a map associated with it, so I wasn't really clear what district that was.
There is a
aimed for.
map.
There's a map in the packet,
Okay.
the planning board packet.
We'll definitely have that for the public hearing, of course, so you can
Okay.
see it.
All right, so probably,
And just so it's clear, it started as a result of the lawsuit. It's a legislative process, so treat it like a zoning amendment. Does it make
Forget about
sense?
how it got here.
Right, does it make sense? That's, there's been quite a bit of work on it to get it to this stage. There could be more work on it. That's the way it works. So, if there's nothing else, I'm going to adjourn the meeting then. Thank you very much.
This was a very good.